In the digital glow of her monitor, Samantha Cortez saw a world she could control, a universe of pixels bending to her will. Her hand, a steady extension of her mind, guided the final, perfect stroke across the screen, breathing life into a design for a client who would never appreciate the soul poured into it. The small office, her self-imposed sanctuary, was wrapped in the profound stillness of a world winding down, a silence that felt heavy, expectant, as if holding its breath. It was that sacred hour when the relentless tide of emails finally receded, leaving only the afternoon sun to cut through the blinds, painting the air with long, ethereal bars of light where dust motes danced like forgotten memories. With a sigh of completion, she leaned back, a fleeting sense of victory washing over her as she prepared to save her work, when the sharp, violent buzz of her phone ripped through the tranquility, a tremor across the polished wood of her desk. A string of digits she didn't recognize, pulsed with a cold, impersonal light, an omen disguised as a simple incoming call. A familiar dread coiled in Samantha's stomach. Unknown numbers were ghosts from a world she tried to keep at bay, a world of demands, of disruptions, of clients whose urgency felt like a violation of her carefully guarded peace. Yet, this time, a deeper instinct, a cold premonition stirred within her, compelling her to confront the unknown. Her thumb hovered, then swiped. She accepted, pressing the cool glass to her ear, a barrier against the words about to come. "Good afternoon. Is this Samantha Cortez?" The voice was a woman's, calm and measured, a professional veneer that did little to soothe the sudden anxiety blooming in her chest. "Yes, speaking," she replied, her own voice a stranger's, thin and distant. "My name is Linda, from the law office of Valerie Stone," the voice continued, each word a carefully placed stone building a bridge to a place she hadn't visited in years, downtown Albuquerque. "I'm calling regarding the estate of your grandmother." And there it was, the name that stopped her heart. Mrs. Gloria Hayes. The name landed not in her ear, but in the pit of her soul, cracking open a vault of complicated grief. "Miss Stone needs to meet with you as soon as possible." The urgency in the tone was a hook, pulling her out of her stunned silence. Samantha's entire body went rigid, her mind a maelstrom of confusion and a sorrow she thought she'd buried. Her fingers, once steady on her mouse, now clenched the phone as if it were a lifeline. "I'm sorry," she breathed. "My grandmother?" The words were a fragile echo, a plea for this to be a mistake. "Yes," the assistant confirmed, her tone unwavering. "It concerns her estate. We'll need you to come in with a photo ID." The final bureaucratic detail sealed it. This was real. This was happening. The name, Stone, was offered as a key, a promise that everything would be made clear in person. A protest formed on Samantha's lips, a desperate attempt to reconcile two clashing realities. "There must be a mistake," she whispered, the words a fragile shield against the unbelievable. "My grandmother didn't." The sentence trailed off, lost in a flood of memories. A woman who owned nothing but sentiment, whose entire world existed within the four walls of a modest rental. "I understand." Linda's voice on the other end was a gentle anchor in the swirling chaos. "But Miss Stone, we'll go over the details." The question that followed felt less like a request and more like the turning of a page in her life. "Are you able to come by today? We're open until 6. A yes escaped from a part of her she didn't seem to control, an automatic response from a body moving on autopilot, though her mind was miles behind, still trying to process the initial shock. The click of the disconnected call echoed in the sudden deafening silence as she sat frozen. For several heartbeats, only the rhythmic pulse of the cursor on her screen marked the passage of time, a tiny, indifferent light on an abandoned project. The words echoed in her mind. The Gloria Hayes estate. A phrase so foreign, a puzzle with no matching pieces. Her grandmother, a woman whose life was a testament to simplicity, whose hands were always busy, either clipping coupons or carefully mending the same beloved cardigans, a ritual of preservation performed year after year. She refused to replace. Her ancient flip phone, its buttons worn smooth from a decade of use, a relic of a simpler time. The very notion that this woman possessed something as formal as an estate felt like a tear in the fabric of reality, a surreal, waking dream. Her fingers moved with a will of their own, a muscle memory that saved her work and plunged the computer screen into darkness. A sudden tightness constricted her chest, a physical manifestation of her fractured reality. It wasn't the sharp sting of fear, but something heavier, a confusion so dense it felt like a fog filling her lungs. She snatched her bag, the motion abrupt, and murmured a farewell to the receptionist, a ghost in the periphery who offered no acknowledgement in return. Then she pushed through the door, stepping out of the familiar and into the blinding unknown. The late-day heat of the New Mexico sun enveloped her instantly, a dry, heavy warmth. The air clung to her skin like a woolen blanket as she navigated the shimmering asphalt. Her world narrowed to the sound of her own footsteps and the sharp click of her car unlocking. The car door sealed her inside with a heavy click, a bubble of silence where 1,000 questions began to scream. She paused, her hands gripping the wheel. Valerie Stone. The name felt foreign, a sharp, legalistic sound that didn't belong in the soft world of her memories. What could this woman possibly want? A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. What was left to be settled? Gloria's legacy, as she knew it, was woven from stories and scents, not legal documents. What else could there possibly be? Faded photo albums capturing forgotten smiles, and the small, ceramic birds Gloria had cherished. Each figurine, each photograph, had been carefully wrapped and boxed away by Samantha, a desperate attempt to contain the sprawling enormity of her grief. The funeral felt like another lifetime. She turned the key, the engine's sudden roar, a jarring intrusion into her fragile quiet. Pulling onto the street, she was absorbed into the city's relentless current, a solitary vessel adrift in a sea of purpose. The steady hum of tires on asphalt offered no comfort, a monotonous drone that failed to drown out the frantic rhythm of her own heart. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel as she navigated toward downtown, toward an answer she wasn't sure she wanted. The New Mexico sun was setting, bleeding across the horizon and painting the world in hues of fire and rust. Stucco buildings glowed like embers, and the sidewalks, fractured with age, held the day's last warmth. The long, distorted shadows of the city stretched out before her, like dark fingers reaching from the past. In the distance, the Sandia Mountains stood as silent, purple-hued witnesses against the vast, open sky. And then, unexpectedly, a memory ambushed her, as sharp and vivid as a shard of glass. Gloria's hands, weathered and kind, guiding her own small fingers in the cool earth of the garden. The sound of her grandmother's laugh, a rich, genuine warmth that could chase away any chill. The quiet, unshakable strength in her eyes, a resilience forged in hardships Samantha had never known. After losing so much, Gloria had remained a beacon. Samantha blinked hard, fighting the sudden hot sting of tears. Why did these ghosts feel so present now? Their whispers louder than they had been in months. The address wasn't far, a simple destination on a map, but the internal distance felt immeasurable. The drive became a strange pilgrimage through a landscape of confusion and a rising tide of premonition. This was more than simple nerves. It was a deep, cellular unease, a sense that the very foundation of her world was about to be tested. Whatever was waiting for her, whatever this estate truly signified, it was a turning point. Samantha felt a tremor of change in the air, a sense that the quiet, predictable narrative of her life was about to be torn open. A fundamental shift was coming, and she was driving straight into its epicenter, completely blind. As Samantha pushed through the heavy glass door, the hum of the city abruptly vanished, replaced by a weighted silence. She had entered the world of Valerie Stone, a realm of hushed tones and binding truths. The chilled air was the first thing she noticed, carrying the faint, sterile scent of old books and lemon polish. It was a world of polished wood and rigid order, a stark, cold reality that felt a million miles from the warmth of the memories now flooding her heart. The air itself felt heavy, almost ceremonial. The receptionist, a silent sentinel, guided her toward a conference room that felt more like a glass cage, a display case for this pivotal moment. Through its transparent walls, the frantic pulse of Central Avenue beat on, utterly indifferent to her fate. Samantha sat, her spine a rigid line of defense, her hands a frantic tangle of nerves in her lap. She held her breath, a prisoner of the silent room, until the soft click of the door latch broke the spell. A woman entered, a figure of composed authority in her mid-50s, carrying the weight of secrets in her posture. Her gaze was sharp, analytical, taking in every detail of Samantha's frayed composure, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe, elegant twist that allowed for no nonsense. "Miss Cortez, I'm Valerie Stone." The voice was a calm, low instrument. "Thank you for coming so quickly." On instinct alone, Samantha's body rose, a puppet responding to the strings of professional courtesy. She took the offered hand, feeling the unsteady thunder of her own pulse against Valerie's firm, warm grip. "I wasn't sure what this was about," she confessed, the words a fragile admission of her complete confusion. "Your assistant only mentioned my grandmother's estate." The phrase itself felt like a cruel joke, but Gloria didn't own anything. It was a truth she had built her life upon, a fact as solid as the ground beneath her. Valerie offered a small, knowing nod, a silent acknowledgement of the world she was about to shatter. With deliberate care, she placed a thick folder on the table, its weight seeming to bend the very air around it. It sat between them, a chasm between past and future. "Let's go through this together," she offered gently. The folder opened with a soft sigh, releasing the scent of aged paper and ink, the ghost of a hidden life. Inside, a formidable stack of documents lay in wait, their sheer volume a contradiction to everything Samantha knew. They were meticulously clipped and marked with colored tabs, a rainbow of order against her internal chaos. The first page that swam into her focus was a property title, the legal script, a language from another planet. Then Valerie slid it aside, revealing another, and another, a silent, undeniable trinity of ownership. Samantha leaned in, drawn by a force she couldn't name, the air catching in her throat like a physical blow. "Your grandmother," Valerie began, her voice a steady anchor in Samantha's swirling reality. She paused, letting the silence amplify the words. "Owned 3 residential units, right here in Albuquerque. One in Nob Hill." The names were familiar, yet suddenly alien. One in Uptown, and one near Old Town. Each location was a nail hammered into the coffin of her old life. All of them fully paid off. Samantha blinked, and the city outside blurred into a meaningless smear of light and motion. A roaring static filled her head. The words were just sounds, refusing to form a coherent, believable thought. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That can't be." But Valerie's unwavering gaze continued, a silent confirmation of the impossible truth, unmoved by the storm brewing in Samantha's eyes. "And this," the lawyer continued, her voice a steady anchor, as her finger tapped another document with quiet finality, "is the deed to a modest cabin, nestled just beyond the edge of Corrales, surrounded by nearly 2 acres of private land." A painful, erratic rhythm pounded in Samantha's chest. Each sheet of paper felt like a lead weight, as though a spectre of her grandmother, a woman of hidden depths and silent fortunes, was materializing from the ink, a stranger emerging with every legal clause. I don't understand," Samantha breathed, the words a fragile mist in the heavy air. Gloria had been a woman of social security checks, a devotee of clipped coupons. Her mantra, a constant, gentle refrain, was that she had nothing left to her name. She valued her privacy above all else, Valerie offered, her tone softening with empathy. But she was also a woman of incredible discipline. She began investing when she was young, built her savings in the shadows, and employed the advisor whose sole purpose was to keep her 2 lives utterly separate and unseen. These were acquired decades in the past, when the world and its prices were much different. Samantha fought to draw a full breath. The air in the room felt suddenly thin, stolen by the sheer weight of the revelation. That her grandmother had shouldered this immense secret through all her years, never once letting a hint escape, never a word of pride, not even the faintest whisper of her hidden world, struck Samantha with more force than any number typed on the page. With practiced calm, Valerie retrieved one last item from the leather-bound folder, a smaller envelope, its flap sealed with care, addressed to Samantha in Gloria's own, beautifully precise handwriting. "And this," Valerie said, pushing it gently across the polished wood, "this was meant only for you." A message she had left with one purpose, for one person, you. Her final wish was that you hear these words in solitude. Samantha's gaze fell upon the envelope, a ghost on the polished table, a knot of unshed tears and unspoken questions tightened in her throat. Her hand refused to move. It was anchored, not by weakness, but by the sheer, crushing weight of revelation. The facts swirled in her mind, a dizzying inventory of a life she never knew. 3 apartments, a remote cabin, parcels of land, and a storm of legal terms and tax codes. It was a foreign language that pressed down on her, a pressure both real and imagined. "There is one final item." Valerie's voice cut gently through the fog. "It was a savings account," she explained, her words soft, as if handling something precious. "An account your grandmother had quietly, secretly fed for more than 40 years. The air in the room grew still. "The balance is," Valerie paused, then simply said, "substantial." A hot sting flooded Samantha's eyes. She never asked for the number. The figure was meaningless, an insult to the sacrifice it represented. Her voice was a prisoner in her own throat. A lifetime of images flashed through her mind. Her grandmother, living a life of careful restraint, of feigned poverty, so that Samantha could one day inherit a world without want. A tremor shot through her body, a violent collision of disbelief, profound grief, and a love so vast and aching it felt like a new kind of sorrow. Only then did her hand finally move, a slow, reverent motion toward the envelope, her fingertips brushing against the paper, feeling the faint indentations of that familiar, beloved handwriting. "Take all the time you need," Valerie murmured, sensing the shift in the room. "Whatever you feel, whatever questions arise after you, I will be here for you." The words were a lifeline. Samantha could only nod, her fingers closing around the letter, clutching it as if it were not paper and ink, but something fragile, sacred, and impossibly alive. That evening, as twilight bled across the window panes, Samantha sat on the edge of her bed. The envelope lay in her open palms, feeling both as light as a feather and as heavy as a stone. The apartment was a hollow chamber of silence, waiting for one last story to be told. The room held its breath, the only sound a low, hypnotic whir from the ceiling fan above. It was a sound that mixed with the faint murmur of city life bleeding through the window, a lonely symphony for one. Before her, a life laid bare in paper, stacks of deeds and financial reports, the cold, hard facts of a fortune built. They sat on the polished wood of her dining table, yet her eyes saw none of it. Her focus was a laser, fixed on a single, small envelope the color of aged cream. Her own name, Samantha, was penned across its surface in Gloria's familiar, steady hand, a script that somehow held more gravity, more substance, than all the legal documents combined. A slow, shaky breath escaped her lips as her fingers finally broke the delicate seal. The air shifted, carrying a ghost of a scent, faint, clean lavender. It was Gloria's scent, an aroma that lived in the memory of her grandmother's hidden drawers. A sudden, sharp pang of nostalgia, so vivid it was almost a physical ache. With trembling hands, Samantha unfolded the crisp paper, her gaze catching on the lines of ink. She traced the elegant, looping script, a phantom from a past she thought was lost forever. The same handwriting from every birthday card, a faithful mark of love she'd taken for granted. And then, the words appeared, a voice from the page. "My dearest Samantha." The beginning was simple, yet it was enough to make her entire world constrict. A knot formed deep in her throat as Gloria's story began to unspool in silent ink. She wrote of a youth spent chasing dreams, of tucking away every spare dollar with fierce determination. Each coin was a promise, a brick in the foundation of a future she was building alone. She painted a picture of buying her first tiny apartment in a younger, sleepier Albuquerque, a time before the city bloomed and the desert land became so very precious. The letter spoke of her grandmother's tireless spirit, of juggling 2 jobs not for weeks, but for years, of clipping coupons, not from a place of desperation, she explained, but from a fierce, unwavering discipline that bordered on obsession. A refusal to let a single penny go to waste when it could be put to work, growing silently. Then, the narrative shifted, moving to the cabin nestled in Corrales, her secret sanctuary. She'd bought it not as an asset, but as a refuge, a haven carved from wood and stone, a place where, she confessed in her elegant script, she prayed Samantha would one day find solace. And just as that warmth settled in Samantha's heart, The ink on the page signaled a gentle but definite shift, becoming more solemn. The elegant script on the page seemed to tighten, the lightness fading into a grave confession about any of this. Gloria wrote, "A secret, her words now a whisper from the past, that I have guarded for one reason alone, because love can make even thee." For she knew a fundamental, aching truth, that love, in its boundless power, strongest women vulnerable. Possesses a terrible ability to disarm even the most formidable woman. Watched you give, and I worry. A lifetime of watching Samantha pour her soul out like water had etched a deep line of concern in Gloria's heart, that certain people in your life may. It was a silent, gnawing fear that the well of her granddaughter's generosity was being drained. Take advantage of that giving heart. By those who had no intention of ever replenishing it. Samantha's pulse slowed. She read the air in the room grew heavy, each beat of Samantha's heart a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. Next lines twice. I fear Adrian does not. Her eyes scanned the words, blurred them with disbelief, then refocused with a brutal clarity. A premonition about Adrian. To understand how to stand beside you as a man, her grandmother saw, who could not grasp the concept of standing beside her as a true partner, equal. I fear Marisol sees you as an equal. Then, another name, another betrayal laid bare. Marisol, whose friendship was revealed as a mask, someone to use when convenient. You for something cold, something born of calculated convenience, deserve a life built on respect, not. The ink seemed to scream a truth Samantha had been too afraid to hear. She was worthy of a foundation of respect, control, not a gilded cage of control. The words hit deeper than Samantha. Each word was a shard of glass, embedding itself in a part of her she hadn't known was still so tender, expected, sharp, almost unbearable. The pain was astonishing, a sharp, blinding ache that stole the air from her lungs, had spent years brushing aside small. A lifetime of slights flashed before her eyes, the subtle dismissals she'd ignored, comments, surrendered dreams, the quiet shelving of her own ambitions, the 1,000 tiny surrenders she had made in the name of peace. Compromises, she told herself, she had labeled them compromises, the normal give and take of a relationship. Praise normal. Hearing her grandmother name, but seeing them written in her grandmother's hand, they were exposed for what they truly were. Concessions. Them so plainly felt like a hand. Gloria's honesty was a physical force, a phantom hand closing around her heart, gripping her chest. Gloria's voice squeezing until the suffocating truth could no longer be denied. The letter grew steadier, almost stern. Then, the tone shifted again, the ink pressing harder into the page, with a resolve born of fierce, protective love, in its tenderness. Independence is not. It was a stern tenderness, delivering the next vital lesson. True independence, my love, the letter seemed to say, born from wealth, Samantha. It's born, is not forged from money. Samantha, it is not found in a bank account, from clarity. I leave these properties. It is born from clarity. The properties, the savings, they weren't just assets, and savings to you, so that you may stand. They were a key, a tool, a gift of choice. On your own feet, if ever the ground, they were a foundation she could stand on, should the world she had built for herself ever begin to crumble. Beneath you shifts. Do not tell Adrian. A final, chilling warning followed, a whisper from beyond the veil. Unless you are certain we're his, keep this from Adrian. Unless you are absolutely certain his heart stands with yours, and not merely with your fortune. Where true allegiance was anchored. A command, a plea, asterisk, watch, listen, asterisk, guard what is to come, asterisk. And with that final loving mandate, a single, hot tear escaped her, a liquid pearl of grief landing directly on the ink. It made the script bleed, a perfect mirror of how her own reality was now dissolving, the sharp edges of her denial softening into a painful truth. With the back of her hand, Samantha made a futile attempt to sweep the evidence of her sorrow away. But it was a broken dam. A silent, steady stream of tears followed, charting paths of long-held pain down her cheeks. Her fingertips pressed hard against her eyelids, a desperate, physical effort to hold back the flood of realization. She drew a ragged breath, the sound of a carefully constructed world fracturing. For so long, she had told herself that the cold silences and the growing distance were merely seasons in a marriage, temporary storms to be weathered. She had labeled the casual cruelty of his words, the subtle chipping away at her confidence, as nothing more than the side effects of external pressures, fleeting anxieties that had nothing to do with the heart of their bond. But to see those same poisoned moments catalogued, not by an enemy, but by the one person who loved her unconditionally, reflected in Gloria's loving scrawl, each word a testament to a lifetime of watching, knowing. It was to see the truth through her grandmother's clear, unwavering eyes. The wisdom etched into those lines transformed her denial into an unbearable weight, a truth she could no longer outrun. When the final word was absorbed, a profound silence fell over the room and within her soul. With reverent hands, Samantha folded the paper along its original creases. A sacred text now. She slid it back into the envelope, clutching it to her chest, not as a letter, but as a shield. Sinking back against the pillows, her gaze drifted upward, lost in the hollow space of the room. The ceiling fan spun in a lazy, hypnotic rhythm, a metaphor for the monotonous loop her life had become. In the quiet, she could already hear the phantom echo of Adrian's voice, should he ever discover this secret. A storm of indignation, a torrent of accusations, the chilling entitlement she now saw so clearly, the interrogation, the ownership in his tone, the web of expectations he would weave around this inheritance. A performance of control he wouldn't even bother to conceal, and Gloria, somehow, had foreseen it all. Her grandmother's love had been a telescope, seeing past the horizon of Samantha's own perception. A whisper, sharp as a shard of glass, cut through the silent room, a vow made only to herself. He will not know. Not yet. In that moment, a seed of defiance took root in the barren soil of her heart. This was Gloria's true legacy, a gift that dwarfed the value of any deed or title. It was the gift of sight, a chance to finally see the bars of her gilded cage, a chance to make a choice that was truly her own, to take the first, trembling step, onto a path she hadn't even known existed, a future she would now build for herself, a name that now had a face, a ghost she could finally picture in her mind's eye. And for this moment, the storm would rage only within. Her silence would be her shield. The letter, a thin paper tombstone for her marriage, lay on Samantha's nightstand. It remained there long after she'd mechanically changed her clothes, an unblinking eye in the dark. She extinguished the lights, but its presence was a physical weight in the room. It was a quiet, sickening pulse that throbbed in the absolute blackness. Sleep was a distant country she couldn't reach. Instead, the past began its haunting. Memories began to seep through the cracks in her denial, first as a trickle, then as a tidal wave she was powerless to stop, pulling her under. 9 years, nearly a full decade of her life, she realized, had been spent with Adrian. A life she had once naively believed was a fortress, solid and true. She thought it was built on the bedrock of partnership, of shared futures, and of a quiet, steady love. But lying there, paralyzed in her own bed, the illusion crumbled. In the cold, impartial glow filtering through the window from the street lamp, she felt the suffocating presence of a truth she could no longer outrun. It gathered around her like a fog, and each memory she held dear began to curdle. Every moment was now cast in a grotesque new light, reshaped by the poison of Gloria's words. It had all started so innocently, hadn't it? Or so she had told herself. Back then, Adrian's charm was a kind of sunlight. He was ambitious, magnetic, and radiated a warmth that felt like a private gift, just for her, a warmth that had made her feel chosen. So when Marisol, her own blood, had first lost her job, her world collapsing, and asked to stay for just 1 month, Samantha's heart had opened without a moment's hesitation. She had always relished being the generous one, the capable one. She took pride in helping family. But the single month stretched, bleeding, into 2, then a silent 6, and then, impossibly, an entire year had vanished. And with time, Marisol's presence began to colonize the space. Her toiletries, a vibrant, foreign army, conquered the guest bathroom. Her shoes began to multiply, lining the entryway like territorial markers, and her opinions began to fill every pocket of silence in the apartment, an invasive species choking out Samantha's own thoughts. A memory, sharp and cold as shattered glass, surfaced in the darkness of the bedroom. It was the first time her voice, trembling but determined, had given sound to the forbidden thought. Perhaps it was time for Marisol to find a home of her own. She watched Adrian's face transform. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a glacial judgment that saw her not as a partner, but as something unspeakably cruel. "She's my sister," he'd said, the words a shield for Marisol and a sword for her. "You know what she's been through." The question that followed was a verdict in itself. Why would you even bring that up? And there it was, the guilt. It coiled in her stomach, a hot, venomous thing that choked the rest of her words into silence. And so, the temporary became permanent. Marisol stayed, a constant, quiet storm in their home. Samantha turned onto her side, the movement feeling impossibly heavy, as if the years of silence were weighing her down. Her fingers traced an aimless path along the crisp fold of the bedsheet, as if trying to smooth out the tangled timeline of her own concessions. Each memory that followed was another small, precise incision into her soul. She could hear Marisol's voice, a delicate instrument of erosion, chipping away at her confidence. "You're a bit old for that style, aren't you?" A gentle question that was really a judgment. "That color does nothing for you, Sam," a casual comment that meant, "you are fading," and she remembered the sting of Adrian's silence, his refusal to be her shield. He'd offer only a hollow shrug, the casual gesture of a man choosing his side. Marisol means well, as if good intentions could ever excuse the slow poisoning of her spirit. Soon it wasn't just clothes, it was the architecture of her life, her career choices, the friends she kept, the very color she wanted to paint the walls of her own home. Every decision, big or small, was submitted to the silent tribunal of Marisol's opinion, a silent, suffocating approval process she had never agreed to. That job has no future. The words were a closing door. That friend is far too selfish for you. The words were an isolating wall. Why spend money on a hobby? It doesn't really seem like you. The words were a cage, and Samantha, desperate for harmony, craving the simple peace of being loved, began to pay the price. She conceded, trading away pieces of herself, bit by painful bit. The vibrant world of her painting class was the first to be sacrificed. The art classes, once a splash of color in her week, had faded to gray. The faces of once cherished friends became distant memories. Laughter over weekend lunches fell silent, replaced by a quiet compliance, her own voice a ghost in her throat. She learned to swallow the bitter taste of injustice, a habit that slowly starved the woman she used to be. That vibrant girl, the one with a mind alight with questions and a quiet fire in her soul, felt like a character from a forgotten story, a stranger she barely recalled. He hadn't broken her with one single blow, but with 1,000 tiny, imperceptible cuts over the years. Each cut took a piece, and now, with her eyes squeezed shut, she could feel the hollow spaces left behind. A familiar vice gripped her chest. Gloria knew. The thought was a lightning strike in the darkness. Her grandmother had seen the fracturing, had perceived the truth through the carefully constructed facade of their brief visits. Even across the miles, through the static of strained phone calls, Gloria's wisdom had pierced the veil. She had seen the very thing Samantha had spent years forcing herself to ignore, the truth she buried daily. It wasn't love's compromise, it was a slow, suffocating control, a constant pressure, an emotional erosion masterfully disguised as the sacred duty of a wife. Her palm flew to her forehead, the skin clammy, as if to physically hold back the overwhelming flood of clarity. A shaky breath escaped her lips, carrying with it the weight of years of denial. As the truth finally found its footing, it settled not in her mind, but in her bones. She hadn't just compromised, she had actively made herself smaller. She had contorted her very soul to fit into the cramped space he allowed her, all to maintain a fragile, illusory peace, all to preserve the shell of a marriage, to escape the labels he would surely use. Difficult, demanding, ungrateful. The fear of those words had been her cage for 9 long years. 9 years of dimming her own light so his could seem brighter, of hushing her spirit so his voice could echo. She had ceded her territory, bit by bit, until there was nothing left. 9 years of a slow, quiet vanishing. And the most terrifying part? She hadn't even noticed she was gone until this very moment. Her gaze drifted back to the letter lying on the table, the paper seeming to pulse with a life of its own. Gloria's elegant script, a faint whisper in the encroaching twilight, held the weight of a final, desperate plea. In that dim room, the realization dawned. Her grandmother had known long before Samantha could even form the words. She had known before Samantha had dared to admit the truth, even to the silence of her own heart. Before she understood the staggering price of her silence, Gloria hadn't just left her an inheritance. She had left her a lifeline, a flare sent from the past, a warning etched in ink. It was a mirror, reflecting a life so diminished that Samantha could barely recognize the woman staring back, a life she had willfully refused to see. And now, with the truth laid bare, there was no turning away. In the profound quiet of the night, a space where truths could no longer hide, a revelation bloomed in the darkness of her mind, one she had long since pushed away. This wasn't a transfer of deeds and titles. It was a reclamation of a soul, the rediscovery of the woman she was meant to be. A homecoming. The next dusk found Samantha tracing familiar roads back to an unfamiliar life. She had let the car drift after work, the engine's hum, a poor substitute for a steady heart. Her mind was a tangled map of possibilities, and she drove, hoping the motion would somehow straighten the lines. She was trying to anchor herself in the violent current of this new reality. The world had tilted on its axis, and she was just trying to find her footing. The Albuquerque sky bled out in hues of bruised purple and dying embers, a dramatic backdrop for the quiet chaos unfolding within her as she finally parked. Each step up the stairs was a conscious effort, a fight against gravity and a crushing exhaustion. The strap of her bag dug into her shoulder, a pale imitation of the weight pressing on her spirit. Her thoughts were leaden, heavier than any physical burden she could carry. But as she neared her own front door, an invisible hand seemed to halt her in her tracks. The door, her sanctuary, was not sealed. It was cracked open. A sliver of space, barely an inch, a wound in the familiar wood. And through that wound, a poison was leaking out in the form of sound. Voices, muffled but sharp, coiled in the air of her apartment. She recognized the low, simmering resentment of Adrian's tone. And beneath it, the cutting hiss of Marisol's whisper, sharp as broken glass. Samantha's world froze on its already tilted axis. The air crystallized in her lungs. Motion ceased. Thought ceased. There was only the act of listening, as if her life depended on it. "I'm telling you," Marisol's voice sliced through the silence. "She's a child playing with fire. She can't possibly manage any of this." A pause, thick with disdain. Valerie Stone finally called her. The papers must be in her hands by now. The news landed like a stone in Samantha's gut. A heavy sigh from Adrienne, laced with a frustration so bitter it was almost tangible. "I just can't wrap my head around why that old crone would leave everything to her." The words hung in the air, a venomous inventory of her inheritance. Those properties, 3 apartments, a secluded cabin in Corrales. Marisol's voice dripped with an envy so potent it was almost tangible. For what? She barely lifted a finger for Gloria. And on the other side of the wall, a truth colder than ice began to seep into Samantha's soul. Her very blood seemed to freeze. Marisol let out a sound, a derisive puff of air. "Please, it was pure, dumb luck, that's all. The woman is, and has always been, utterly gullible. An open book of trust. That," Marisol thought with a grim satisfaction, "is the key. That is precisely why this entire charade will succeed." A faint shuffle broke the silence. It was Adrian, pacing like a predator, his patience wearing thin. "Perhaps," he conceded, "but we have to force her hand, and fast. If she liquidates those assets, we're looking at hundreds of thousands in pure, untraceable cash." It was the seed money for everything they dreamed of, the solar project, the grand investment plan, their entire future. "All of it, all of it," Marisol whispered back. The words a sacred, greedy vow. But the approach must be subtle. We need her to believe this is her own noble idea. We will frame it as a sacrifice for family. We will weave a tapestry of guilt so thick she'll suffocate if she doesn't. Offer to help. Each word was a hammer blow against Samantha's heart, a painful, rhythmic thud of betrayal. Her hand flew to the wall, fingers splayed, seeking an anchor, in a world that was suddenly spinning away from her. And then, Adrian's voice dropped, laying out the final piece of their monstrous puzzle. And once the ink is dry, and the transfers are complete, he continued, the plan already a reality in his mind. His tone was terrifyingly placid, like the surface of a frozen lake. I'll file for divorce. A clean, simple break. He was so certain she won't even contest. She never fights for anything. Behind the door, Marisol released a small, sharp laugh, a sound like shattering glass. Quietly, she affirmed, exactly. She'll just fold, just like she always does, and you, Adrian, will finally be unburdened. And, he added, a final, surgical thought. With the inheritance already turned to cash, there won't be a single asset left to connect me to her. No, messy division of property. And for Samantha, the betrayal was so absolute, she felt the floor drop away, a sickening, slow-motion wave of nausea rising from the pit of her stomach. A chasm of ice opened in her gut. They knew everything, and her mind splintered, searching for the source of the betrayal. A careless whisper from the attorney's office, a stranger's watchful eye, or the more horrifying truth that had been lurking just beneath the surface, that Adrian's constant attention hadn't been friendship, but surveillance. She had been studying her, predicting her, waiting for this very moment. Samantha willed her own body to betray nothing. She froze, a statue carved from burgeoning fear, every muscle screaming. The air in her lungs felt thin, sharp, a blade with every breath. Her animal instinct shrieked to run, to vanish, but a new, cold clarity held her fast. With a surreal slowness, her hand drifted into the darkness of her bag. The cool glass of her phone felt like a lifeline as she slipped it from its hiding place. Her thumb trembled, a traitor to her resolve. As she pressed the glowing red icon to record, she steadied her hand, positioning the phone near the thin sliver of light. That crack in the door was a portal, revealing the monstrous truth of her world. Marisol's voice, now stripped of all its manufactured warmth, slithered into the hall. We just have to be patient. The words were a venom coated in honey. Play nice. Make her feel appreciated. Each syllable was a nail in the coffin of their friendship. Once she sells, we get the money, and then... The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. A sharp, final snap of fingers cut through the air. Done. Then Adrian's voice, a smug echo of the verdict. She'll never see it coming. The hallway warped, its familiar patterns twisting into a grotesque mockery before Samantha's blurred vision. A deep, soul-level coldness spread through her, a stark contrast to the slick sweat filming her palms. She clung to the sound, forcing herself to endure one more heartbeat, one more word, just long enough to cage their poison, to trap this venomous truth in a digital file. Her thumb moved, a silent press ending the recording, sealing their confession. She retreated from the door as if it were scorched by the heat of their lies. Moving like a ghost down the hall, she left the person she used to be behind. The only sound in her universe was the frantic, thunderous drumming of her own heart. Her grandmother's words echoed from a distant past, no longer a gentle warning but a terrible prophecy fulfilled. And she knew, with chilling certainty, that nothing could ever prepare you for the moment love shows its fangs. A purpose far more sinister than simple greed. They weren't just using her, they were orchestrating her complete and utter erasure from her own life. Sleep was a forgotten country that night. Samantha was a ghost haunting her own bed. She lay paralyzed, watching the cold, digital numbers of the clock tick away the final moments of her ignorance. The recorded conversation was a venomous loop playing inside her skull, each syllable a fresh cut, until the words felt like they were etched directly onto her bones. When the first grey light of dawn bled through the blinds, it illuminated a terrifying clarity. The thought of facing Adrian, of seeing that mask of affection, was physically sickening. Not after hearing the truth of his heart, not after knowing the void that lay behind his eyes. A tremor ran through her hands as she pulled on her clothes, a stark contrast to the ice-cold certainty that had settled in her soul. She had to fight back. By mid-morning, that resolve had carried her here, into the sterile silence of her car, parked just outside the imposing glass doors of a law firm. She stared at the building, home to Valerie Stone, her only potential ally. Her phone, the very device that held her nightmare, was gripped in a white-knuckled fist. The call had been a choked whisper, but Valerie's response was instant, firm, a promise of an immediate audience, a small flicker of light in an encroaching darkness. And now, stepping into the conference room that had once felt so professional, so safe, she watched Valerie close the heavy door, the soft click echoing like a seal being placed on her old life. It was a deliberate, protective gesture, creating a sanctuary for the truth to be unleashed. "Samantha," Valerie's voice was a low anchor in the storm of her thoughts. "Your voice on the phone. It sounded like you were standing on a cliff edge. Tell me what's wrong." Words failed her. The betrayal was too vast to be spoken, too monstrous to be shaped by her own tongue. So, with a shaking hand, she simply unlocked her phone, her thumb hovering over the recording. She pressed play, placing the small black rectangle in the center of the polished table like a final, damning piece of evidence. A moment of silence, and then the room was poisoned by the sound of Adrian's voice. It was a voice she once loved, now rendered grotesque by its cold, clinical cruelty. Then came Marisol's, dripping with a smugness that turned Samantha's blood to ice. Together, their disembodied voices wove a chilling narrative of their conspiracy. The strategy was laid bare: force Samantha to sell everything, to liquidate her entire inheritance. Wealth, all cunningly extracted under the fragile guise of family, only to be discarded once her inheritance was theirs. A calculated divorce, the final, brutal severance. Valerie absorbed it all, the silence in her office growing heavier with each recorded lie. A cold stillness settled over her features, a mask of glacial resolve solidifying. The final click of the recording echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. She leaned back, the leather of her chair groaning softly, her hands interlaced, a fortress of calm. "I am profoundly glad you brought this to me." Her voice was low, yet resonant with power. "And even more so, that you have this irrefutable truth captured." Samantha's throat felt tight, a knot of pure terror. "But what do I do?" The words were a choked whisper. "They have no idea I know. Their plans are already in motion, a tidal wave about to crash over me." A shift occurred in Valerie's demeanor, her voice shedding its empathy for something harder, something forged in fire. It was the tone of a commander, a woman who had charted a course through these very same treacherous waters time and time again. "First," she began, "let's establish the bedrock of your position. New Mexico law is unequivocally clear on this matter. Any and all assets from an inheritance are legally defined as separate property. This is a critical distinction. They belong to you, and you alone. Adrian possesses absolutely no legal claim to those apartments, that cabin, or a single cent of your grandmother's life savings. Unless a grave mistake is made, that mistake would be commingling those funds, or willingly transferring the ownership. As it stands, he is legally powerless to touch it. Every move would require your explicit, undeniable consent." A single, shuddering breath escaped Samantha's lips, a ghost of hope in the sterile room. Relief warred with a lifetime of doubt. "So, he can't make me sell." The question was fragile, barely audible. "Absolutely not." Valerie's reply was a blade of pure steel. "But this is where the true danger begins. You must be vigilant. A man who believes your fortune is his birthright will not be deterred by the law alone. Become unpredictable when they realize they can't access it. Your priority now is to protect yourself and the assets." Valerie pulled a notepad toward them, writing a short list in careful, bold strokes. "Here's what you need to do, immediately. 1. Open a private bank, account in your name, only at a bank Adrian doesn't use. 2. Rent a safe, deposit box for all deeds, statements, and your grandmother's letter. 3. Move all property documents, every original copy out of your apartment. 4. Do not tell Adrian anything. Not about the account, not about the Brees properties, not about the letter. 5. Continue life as usual. No sudden changes, no confrontations. Keep everything exactly as they expected. Samantha nodded, absorbing each step as though they were lifelines. This is the beginning of your exit. Strategy, Valerie said gently but firmly. You will leave on your timeline, not theirs. But for now, silence is protection. Samantha exhaled shakily. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it had shape. Now, something she could navigate, instead of drown in. Thank you, she. The sound, barely a breath in the still air. Valerie's hand found hers, a firm, grounding pressure. The touch was an anchor, pulling Samantha back from the edge of a terrifying abyss. You are not walking this path alone, Valerie affirmed, her voice a promise of strategy and righteous action. And, in the sanctuary of that small room, with the city's heartbeat muffled below, a tectonic shift occurred deep within Samantha's soul. It was the first true choice she had made to dismantle the gilded cage that Adrian and Marisol had so meticulously constructed around her, a world built on their illusion of control. She was finally reaching for the life that had always been hers to write. In the days that followed, the familiar lines of her house transformed into a hostile landscape. Samantha learned to move through it not as a resident, but as a spy, each step a calculated risk on a floor of cracked glass. Carefully, silently. Every nerve ending was a live wire, attuned to the subtle currents of danger. Valerie's counsel was a mantra, a secret map replaying in the theater of her mind. Every quiet act was a piece of her escape plan falling into place. She secured her identity, her very essence on paper, far from his reach. She opened a new, invisible financial lifeline, breathing life into it with the cash. Her grandmother had left her a legacy of love, now funding a revolution. The cool metal of the safe deposit key rested against her heart, a secret promise, worn beneath a flawless facade of domestic calm. On the surface, the portrait was unchanged, but inside, the canvas was being violently repainted. Adrian, a creature of instinct, sensed the shift. He felt the change in her stillness, but his arrogance misinterpreted it. Instead of a challenge, he saw surrender, and responded with a tactic far crueler than rage. He offered her warmth. One evening, as the scent of reheated food filled the kitchen, a space that had become her silent battleground, the air grew heavy. He materialized behind her, a ghost from a past she was trying to bury, his arms sliding around her waist in a pantomime of affection that felt like shackles. The gesture was a relic from a time before the cruelty, his voice dropping into a register of feigned tenderness she hadn't heard in an eternity. You, no, he began, the casualness of his tone a chilling performance. I've been thinking, perhaps it's time we finally started our family. The word landed between them, heavy and cold as a stone, and Samantha's hands clenched on the edge of the counter. A family? Her own voice sounded distant, a hollow echo in the suddenly silent room. Yeah. Marisol leaned in, her lips brushing Samantha's cheek with a kiss that was a masterpiece of calculation. It was too light, too careful, a gesture not of passion but of persuasion. I mean, we're stable now, right? Marisol's voice was smooth, weaving a narrative of security. We're in a good place. A place, Samantha thought, that felt more like a precipice. And maybe it's also time to think about a bigger house, something. Marisol's gaze drifted, picturing a grander stage for her plans. Spacious, modern, something we could. Each word was a baited hook, cast into the waters of Samantha's old dreams, really build a future in. Samantha's expression remained a placid mask, a calm surface over a churning sea of realization. Her face was a study in neutrality, but a shard of ice was forming in her gut. It settled deep within her, a cold, hard certainty. Marisol wasn't even trying to hide the script anymore. A bigger house. It was the first act of the play. Starting a family, building for the future. The second and third acts, designed to ensure there would be no escape, these were words tailor-made to invoke a very specific cocktail of emotions: guilt, obligation, and the crushing weight of sacrifice. Everything she had always relied on to keep Samantha in line. With immense effort, Samantha turned. The movement was fluid, slow, as she forced a smile that felt like cracking porcelain. It's a big step. The bait was laid, and Marisol lunged for it, her relief almost comical. "Exactly," she said, her voice suddenly bright, artificially so. "Which is why we need to start planning early." The manufactured urgency was a tell, a gambler's nervous twitch. "These things take, well, resources," she added, the word a delicate placeholder for Samantha's money, "but we'll figure it out." Samantha offered a single, slow nod, a silent, ambiguous agreement. She said nothing more. On the counter, her phone lay face down, its dark screen a silent, secret witness. The lens was open, the microphone live. It was already recording. The next morning, the performance resumed with a flourish. Marisol was up at dawn, an apron tied around her waist, staging an elaborate breakfast. It was a culinary masterpiece designed to be Samantha's absolute favorite, a meal so thoughtful it bordered on aggressive, one she had pointedly never bothered to make before. The kitchen air grew thick with the scent of cinnamon and roasted peppers, but beneath the cloying sweetness, Samantha detected another note, the acrid smell of desperation. But the sweetness in Marisol's voice was a gilded cage, thick and suffocating. "Samantha, sit, eat," she insisted, her tone a velvet command. The chair scraped the floor as she pulled it out, a deliberate, theatrical gesture. "You work far too hard." The unspoken addendum hung in the air. Asterisk, "Let me take care of things for you." Asterisk. Samantha sat, her spine rigid with a caution she couldn't name, as Marisol began the ritual. She was served a plate with a reverence that felt unnervingly ceremonial. "You know," Marisol began, her voice casual, "Adrienne let it slip that you were discussing the future." The words were chosen like chess pieces, each with a purpose. Families, a home, all the wonderful, expensive dreams. A soft laugh escaped her lips, a sound as hollow as a porcelain doll. "I am just so thrilled for you." Samantha felt the weight of the moment and offered only a quiet shield. "Thank you." But Marisol, sensing the wall, immediately began to scale it. "So," she pressed, "have you considered how you'll finance it all?" The question landed, sharp and precise. "I mean, children are an investment," she mused, listing the items like an accountant. "A house is an investment. Life is an endless expense." She leaned forward, shrinking the space between them, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "I only ask because, after everything with your grandmother." The name was the key, turning the lock. "I can only imagine the sheer volume of things you have to sort through." And there it was, the true purpose of the meal, laid bare on the table. The gentle, persistent prying, the fishing for information, all artfully disguised, in a suffocating blanket of false concern. Deliberately, Samantha lifted her coffee cup, a calculated move. She let the rising steam obscure her face, a momentary fortress of vapor. "It's a lot to process right now," she stated, her voice a calm, unreadable surface. "There's not much to say yet." And in that quiet refusal, a battle was won. For a fleeting instant, Marisol's carefully constructed smile twitched, a crack in the facade. "Well," she recovered, the mask of warmth snapping back into place, of course, "just know that when you're ready to discuss your options, I'm right here for you." The offer felt less like a life raft and more like another trap. Every syllable sounded polished, as if it had been practiced in front of a mirror until it was perfect. All day. The saccharine performance played out in every reflective surface. The charade was relentless. Adrian's phone would light up with texts, each word dripping with a cloying, manufactured affection. Marisol, in person, became a fountain of praise, a constant, suffocating stream of compliments. It was her hair, a masterpiece, her clothes, impeccable, her cooking, divine. No detail was too small to be coated in this false admiration. Their words were a silken melody, but their eyes, in the brief moments they thought she wasn't looking, held the cold, hard glint of chess players. A smug certainty settled in their hearts. They were convinced she was a fly, blissfully unaware, sinking deeper and deeper into the threads of their meticulously woven web. But they were performing in a play where Samantha had already rewritten the final act. She was no longer a character in their story. With every honeyed word they spoke, a silent observer in her pocket meticulously documented the lie. Every smile that never reached the eyes, every gentle nudge towards a future they controlled, every carefully orchestrated conversation that somehow, always, circled back to the topic of her finances. It was all being collected, a digital archive of their deception, with each piece of evidence carefully catalogued. In their eyes, she was a static image of her former self, a portrait of compliance. She played the part flawlessly, the gentle voice, the agreeable nod, the predictable daughter. But inside, a profound transformation was taking place. She was becoming a blade, forged in their fire, honed by their deceit, and they remained utterly blind to the sharpness she now possessed. A mask made of sugar, however, cannot withstand the heat of its own falsehood for long. Before a full week had passed, the carefully constructed kindness of Marisol began to show its first fractures. The sweet veneer started to chip and peel away, a slow, agonizing reveal of the raw, abrasive personality that Samantha had endured for a lifetime. The monster she knew was simply tired of its disguise. It began as tremors before an earthquake, small, almost imperceptible bursts of irritation. A clipped response here, a sigh heavy with unspoken judgment there. But the pressure was building, and soon the entire facade crumbled, returning with the unrestrained force of a bitter storm. It was the inevitable collapse of a performance held for far too long. The breaking point arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. Samantha stepped into the living room, a space now charged with unspoken tension, and the scene was set. There was Marisol, positioned on the couch as if it were a throne, her planner open on her lap, not a tool for organization, but a scepter of control, her private planner. A chill, sharp and sudden, pierced through Samantha. It was the cold dread of being seen, truly seen, without permission. "Are you reading that?" The question escaped her lips, a fragile whisper against Marisol's brazen silence. "Even flinch." "Relax," Marisol murmured, the word a silken dismissal of Samantha's panic. "I was just looking." She flipped a page, the crisp sound an act of casual violation, a deliberate desecration of a sacred space. Rifling through the intimate architecture of another's life as if it were a common magazine, were perfectly normal. "You've been so walled off," Marisol began, her tone a careful blend of faux concern and accusation. "Secretive lately." The word was a loaded weapon, aimed to wound. "I thought maybe I'd see what masterpiece of a private life was consuming you so completely." Her curiosity was a hungry, jealous thing. A surge of protective fire propelled Samantha forward, her hand reaching out to reclaim what was hers. Planner from Marisol's grasp. "Ask," she managed, her voice tight with unshed anger. "Next time, you ask." Marisol's scoff was a sharp, ugly sound. Her arms folded into a fortress of defiance. "If you have nothing to hide, then why build such high walls?" The question was a perfectly crafted piece of psychological warfare. Why does it matter? The sentence hung in the air, a toxic vapor, reframing privacy as guilt. It was a splinter of ice in the warmth of the room, sharp, invasive, and utterly deliberate. Every syllable was intentional, a calculated move in a game only Marisol knew she was playing. Later, as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, Marisol staged her next assault. A feigned stumble, a theatrical sweep of her arm, and Samantha's handbag tumbled to the floor. A universe of private things, a lipstick, a crumpled receipt, a wallet spilled out like secrets exposed to the light. Samantha walked in to find this curated chaos, another boundary shattered, another piece of her invaded. Marisol offered a shrug, a masterclass in feigned innocence. "Maybe if you didn't treat your purse like a vault of state secrets, these things wouldn't happen." The blame, once again, was expertly shifted. The fault was not the intrusion, but the secrets themselves. That night, Marisol began her final maneuver, her voice a carefully modulated performance of concern for Adrienne. She painted a portrait of Samantha, not as a victim, but as the source of all chaos. Paranoid, she whispered, planting the seed. Difficult, she added, watering it with false sympathy. And finally, emotionally unstable. The poison worked its magic. Adrian, the unwitting pawn, approached Samantha before dinner. Her arms were crossed, a perfect mirror of Marisol's earlier defiance. Her voice was no longer warm. It was a blade, honed by irritation. "Sam, this has to stop." The question was an indictment, not an inquiry. "What is going on with you? You've been distant, moody." Adrian recited the script, unaware she was a puppet, leaving Samantha utterly and devastatingly alone in the truth. Secretive. A word he wielded like a weapon, designed to make her feel small and ungrateful. Partners. But partnership felt like a cage. She focused on the rhythmic thud of the knife, a steady beat against his rising tide of suspicion, her movement steady. "I'm fine," she said, the words a fragile shield against his intrusion. "You're not fine." He closed the distance between them, his shadow falling over her hands, a physical claim, lowering his voice as if speaking to her. His voice dropped into that patronizing softness, a tone he reserved for taming something he believed was wild. "Stubborn child. If you want to start a—" He dangled their future, their potential family, like a prize she could only win through submission. "Family, if you want us to move forward." It was a future he was bartering. And the price, she was beginning to understand, was her autonomy. "We need financial transparency, honesty." He recited the words transparency, honesty, as if they were sacred vows she had broken. Trust. Samantha didn't look up. And trust, the final, most bitter irony. Her gaze remained fixed on the board. "I've always been honest. Always been honest." "Then act like it," But her honesty wasn't the currency he sought. "Then act like it," he bit back, the mask of patience cracking, snapped. The following evening. The snap in his voice was a prelude. By the next evening, the air itself felt heavy with unspoken demands. Pressure intensified. Adrian announced. Adrian had summoned them for a family meeting, and she knew it was not a meeting, but a trial. They needed a family meeting, a phrase. That term was a well-worn tool of manipulation in this house, designed to isolate and conquer, that had always made Samantha feel. A familiar coldness crept into her veins, the feeling of being outnumbered, of being judged, small. They sat around the dining table. The polished wood of the dining table reflected their faces like a dark mirror, casting long, accusatory shadows. Samantha on one side, Adrienne, and she was a solitary island, facing a united front, a tribunal of two. Marisol on the other, lined up in quiet. His mother and he sat aligned, their very posture a silent verdict already rendered. Accusation. Adrian clasped his hands. He began the interrogation, his hands clasped piously, a portrait of feigned reason. "Sam, we're worried." Marisol nodded, eyes. "Sam, we're worried." Marisol played her part perfectly, nodding with a sorrow that didn't touch her eyes. Wide in mock concern. "You've changed." Her eyes were wide, a caricature of concern. "You've changed," the mother-in-law pronounced softly. "You're distant. You're keeping things." The accusations were a 1-2 punch. "You're distant. You're keeping things from us." "From us." Adrian leaned in. "We need to—" He leaned across the table, his voice a conspiratorial hiss, shrinking the world down to just their faces. "Know if something is going on. We need to know," he pressed. "If there's a problem, financially. Did your grandmother leave?" And there it was, the heart of the matter. Financially. Did your grandmother leave? Complications. Complications, debts, documents, you. The questions were a volley of veiled greed. Debts, he hoped. Documents, he prayed. Can't handle a loan? We can help you if... The offer of help was the most venomous part of the attack. We can help you, if you just let us. You let us. Samantha watched them. She watched their performance, a silent spectator to their poorly disguised avarice. Silently. Her heart beat steady. Her heart was a steady drum against her ribs, a rhythm of quiet defiance they couldn't hear. Desperation beneath their questions was. She could see past the mask of concern to the raw, hungry desperation that pulsed beneath. Unmistakable, an edge of panic wrapped. It was the sharp, unmistakable edge of panic, dressed in the suffocating clothes of family love. Marisol's voice was a carefully constructed melody of concern, but underneath, a discordant note of anxiety hummed. "I appreciate it," Samantha heard herself say. The words a smooth, polished stone wall, but truly, there is nothing to discuss at this moment. Each word was a lock clicking into place. A tremor of raw frustration, quickly masked, rippled across Marisol's face. The mask was slipping. "So you times are times hiding something," she accused. The question a desperate grab for the control she was losing. "I'm simply sorting through things," Samantha countered, the vagueness a deliberate, exquisite torture. Her gaze was unwavering, a placid lake over a churning abyss. "When I have something to share," she promised. Knowing it was a promise she would break, "you will know." A sharp, impatient hiss of air escaped Adrien as he threw himself back in his chair. "This isn't healthy, Sam," he chided, his voice dripping with the false honey of a practiced manipulator. Asterisk, "You're shutting us out of your decisions, your money." Asterisk was the unspoken truth. "Maybe," she conceded softly. The words hung in the air, a silken curtain she drew around herself. "I'm just taking my time." It was an answer that was not an answer at all, a denial of the access they had always taken for granted. A silent, frantic conversation passed between Marisol and Adrien in a single, desperate glance. The facade of patient concern was cracking, revealing the ugly impatience beneath. The puppet strings, once held so tightly in their hands, were suddenly, terrifyingly slack. And Samantha, the puppet, was watching the puppeteers with a newfound, chilling clarity. Her expression remained a study in serenity, her voice measured, a masterpiece of deception. But inside, a cold, meticulous part of her brain was cataloguing everything. Every tightening of a jaw, every shared, panicked look, every desperate tremor in their eyes. She offered them a placid void, a serene emptiness where their questions went to die. And in that void, a spark ignited within her, something dormant for far too long. It was the intoxicating, terrifying, and utterly magnificent feeling of power. Her first move was toward the noble apartment, a place untouched by their influence. It was chosen not for its newness, but for its profound sense of distance. It represented an escape, a world away from the gilded cage they had built around her. The building was nestled on a street that seemed to breathe, a tranquil lane tucked away from the city's pulse. Ancient trees formed a canopy overhead, their leaves dappling the sunlight onto the pavement below. Tucked among homes painted in cheerful, sun-faded colors, the unit had been waiting, dormant. It was a silent sanctuary, asleep for years, where a fine grey dust lay like a velvet shroud over the windows, sills, and the air held the ghost scent of seasons long past. But this pocket of the world was hers, a secret kingdom of one. The key turned with a satisfying click in the lock that Saturday. As the sun bled its first pale gold across the horizon, she slipped inside, the world behind her, muted, and let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The floorboards groaned a welcome under her feet. A sliver of light from a tiny balcony cut through the gloom, stretching across the main room like a curious finger, illuminating dust motes dancing in the warm, amber air trapped within. The walls. It was nothing, and yet, inside her, it was everything. It felt like the first page of a story she was finally writing for herself. For hours, she performed a silent ritual, reclaiming the space. Alone, she swept away the past, flinging open windows to chase out the stagnant air. She scrubbed away years of someone else's life from the countertops until her own reflection stared back from the gleaming surface. Old, faded curtains came down, replaced by new ones, bought with untraceable cash. She filled the empty cabinets with the promise of future meals, a quiet rebellion in a can of soup. In the bedroom, she unrolled a simple mattress, the future site of peaceful, dream-filled sleep, a purchase made online, its delivery a masterclass in misdirection, routed to a remote locker Adrien had no idea even existed. This fortress was hers alone. The secret was a heavy, precious stone in her pocket. Her phone buzzed, ignored. A digital leash she refused to acknowledge. Marisol's name flashed on the screen, her questions like frantic taps on a cage. Asterisk, where are you? Why did you sneak out? Asterisk. Each inquiry was a thread in a web she was desperately trying to escape. Her replies, when they came, were mist and shadow, harmless deflections. But when she finally walked back through the door of her old life that afternoon, she carried the evidence of her new one on her skin. A faint, alien perfume of sharp lemon and warm wood polish clung to her clothes. And of course, Marisol, with her predator's senses, noticed immediately. That's a new scent, she observed, her voice honed to a fine, sharp point. Where have you been running off to? The word was a shield, spoken with a stillness she willed into her voice, a fragile dam against the flood of fear. In that moment, Marisol's gaze sharpened, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, a promise forged where words were too dangerous. She offered no reply, and from that day forward, a new, clandestine purpose took root in Samantha's heart. She began a secret choreography, a life constructed in the shadows of her old one. It was a ritual of quiet rebellion, a patient and steady dismantling of her prison, each dawn breaking with a new, secret mission. Before the city stirred, her hand would close around another piece of her soul, smuggling it out into the light. It might be a small silver locket, a cold, smooth weight in her palm, a whisper from the grandmother she barely remembered. Or it could be a pair of leather-bound heirloom books, their pages filled with stories more real to her than her own life. And then, the framed picture of Gloria, her face radiant amidst a riot of garden flowers, a fragile icon of freedom. Each item was a ghost, small enough to vanish without a trace, a secret exodus of the self. She was a phantom thief in her own home, stealing back the life that had been taken from her, careful to leave no void. The shelves had to appear untouched, the surfaces undisturbed, a perfect illusion of domestic peace. Every gesture was a study in control, a tightly wound spring of intention holding her fractured composure together. Later, in the dead of night, with the sound of Adrian's breathing filling the darkness, her real work would begin. While he dreamt, she gathered the mundane artifacts of survival: clothes, life-sustaining medication, toiletries. She sealed them in airtight bags, suffocating the air out of them, a chilling parallel to the life she was living. These precious bundles were then secreted away into the hidden compartment of her suitcase, a tomb for her old life and a cradle for the new. In the blue glow of her screen, she created a digital ghost, uploading copies of vital documents to an anonymous cloud. It was a fortress of data built on a foundation of a new, untraceable email address, a name he would never know. Her mind became a ledger, meticulously recording every item rescued, every memory she was forced to abandon. It was a silent, painful inventory, a tally of what defined her versus what she had to sacrifice. All of it was done with the precision of a surgeon, desperate not to rupture the fragile skin of normalcy. But the facade was cracking. The very air in the apartment began to feel heavy and charged. The unspoken dread thickened with each passing day, a suffocating fog that clung to the walls. Adrian sensed it, a predator sniffing the air for a change in the wind, and he grew restless. He would pace the floor as she stood at the stove, his movements caged and agitated, a storm gathering on the horizon. His gaze became a physical weight upon her, a burning, possessive stare that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. The warmth had vanished from his smile, leaving behind something brittle and sharp, a mask that barely concealed the rage beneath. His inquiries sharpened into interrogations, each word a carefully aimed dart. "Why have you been going out so much? What is it you're doing?" The questions hung in the air, not seeking answers, but demanding submission. Working on? A question that hung in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. He felt a chasm opening between them. Is it the estate? Are you meeting someone? Each word was a desperate cast of a net, trying to catch the truth that was slipping through his fingers. He attempted to wrap the interrogation in the soft fabric of affection, but a tremor of fear vibrated just beneath the surface of his words, a raw, undeniable panic. Marisol, however, was a different kind of predator, silent and far more observant. The moment Samantha entered a room, a sudden, charged silence would fall, as if a secret had been swallowed whole. She would orbit Samantha's personal space, a ghost armed with a feather duster, her movements a pretext for a meticulous search, her gaze snagging on the crisp edges of any document left unattended. She'd pause by the mail slot, a sentry awaiting a dispatch that could seal their fate. Then came the commentary on the clothes, a casual ledger of Samantha's life, cataloguing the fabric she wore to leave, the silhouette she wore to return, even the silk she wore in the privacy of her own bed. "You seem agitated," Marisol offered one evening, her voice a silken trap. "People only get that way," she continued, her eyes gleaming with suspicion, "when a secret is weighing them down." And in that moment, Marisol thought she had her. But Samantha merely offered a smile, a placid, unreadable mask. It was a masterpiece of neutrality, yet beneath it, Samantha felt a seismic shift. She could sense the invisible threads of their control snapping, the structure of their deception beginning to shudder. Their confidence, once so absolute, was dissolving into fear. A tempest of entitlement and panic was brewing within them, a storm born of ignorance. They had no idea of the intricate web she was weaving. They only felt the chilling sensation of their power bleeding away into the ether. And for the first time in 9 long years, Samantha was no longer a pawn reacting to their moves. She was the architect of the entire game. The inevitable rupture came on an evening cloaked in domestic tranquility, the way all true cataclysms begin not with a bang, but with a deceptive stillness. It arrived unannounced, stripped of all fanfare, a raw and sudden reckoning. Samantha had just placed a pot on the stove, the water inside beginning to simmer, mirroring the tension about to boil over. The water on the stove had just begun its soft simmer, a fragile sound in the quiet kitchen, a peace Marisol was about to annihilate. She didn't walk in, she invaded, her heels striking the linoleum like a judge's gavel. A mask of righteous fury was etched onto her features, a familiar and ugly contortion. The pretense of civility, a garment worn thin over the years, was finally cast aside, exposing raw hostility. With the instinct of a predator, she moved deliberately, blocking the path between Samantha and the door. She became a human barricade, her body language screaming that this was not a conversation, but a capture. "We need to talk." Marisol's voice was a blade, sharp and cold. But Samantha refused the bait, her gaze anchored to the swirling steam, a small, desperate act of rebellion. "I'm cooking," she said, her voice a flat line, a shield of mundane domesticity against the coming storm. Marisol advanced, her shadow eclipsing the stovetop, her voice beginning its calculated ascent. "You've been avoiding us," she accused, twisting Samantha's quest for peace into an act of familial treason. "Avoiding the real conversations," she pressed, her definition of real being Samantha's complete surrender. "And frankly," she spat, "we are done being patient." A patience, Samantha knew, that had only ever been a performance. A tremor of adrenaline shot through Samantha's veins, yet by some miracle of will, her hand remained steady. It closed around a wooden spoon, the smooth, worn wood, a pathetic but necessary shield. "What do you want?" The question was heavy with the exhaustion of 1,000 similar battles, and in Marisol's eyes, she saw the answer. A predatory gleam of triumph, "Your inheritance." The words landed like stones. Finally, Samantha turned, the swirling steam parting around her like a curtain rising on the final act. Marisol's arms folded across her chest, a posture of absolute, unshakable self-righteousness. "It belongs to the family," she declared, "not just you." The word family was a cudgel she wielded expertly. "We are all struggling," she continued, painting a desperate portrait, "while you're sitting on a throne you didn't build, properties and money." She listed the assets with a venomous envy that you never even lifted a finger to earn. "It's selfish." That was the word, the one they always used to pin her down. "You need to contribute," she said, the word a soft disguise for surrender, so that we can all finally move forward. Samantha held her gaze, a deep, silent well of resolve that Marisol mistook for weakness. Then, from that quiet depth, a single, solid word emerged. "No." The air thickened, and Marisol's face blanched with shock. "You owe us," she hissed, the disbelief curdling into rage. "Adrian has carried you for years. I've supported you. We have made sacrifices." Each word was a line item on an invisible invoice. Every perceived kindness was now being presented as a debt, due for immediate collection. And this, she sneered, her voice dripping with contempt, is how you repay us? A laugh, sharp and mirthless, nearly broke the surface. But she swallowed it, the bitterness a familiar taste. Instead, her hand found the spoon, and she drew slow, deliberate circles in the simmering pot. She let the silence stretch, a weapon of its own, until a new presence broke the spell. It was Adrienne. He stepped into the kitchen, a man drawn not by the aroma of food, but by the scent of conflict. His gaze swung from his sister's righteous fury to his wife's silent, rigid back. A choice was laid bare before him, a silent, terrible test of loyalty, and in a single, heart-stopping motion that confirmed every dark fear Samantha had ever harbored, he crossed the floor and took his place at Marisol's side, a soldier joining his true battalion. "Sam," he began, the name a cold stone in his mouth, his anger a poorly caged beast. His forced calm was more insulting than any shout. "This kind of behavior is not acceptable." Marisol's right. The words were a verdict, a final severing. "We are supposed to be a team." The word was a mockery, a hollow echo in the space between them. "You cannot keep secrets from us," he declared. The word us, cementing the new alliance, especially financial ones. "This is about our collective future, our family." At that final word, Samantha's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. She placed the spoon on the counter with a quiet click that sounded as loud as a gunshot. Her voice, when it came, was stripped bare of warmth. "This was never about family," she said, naming the lie. "This has always been about control." The muscle in Adrian's jaw leaped, a visible tremor of his crumbling composure. "Don't make this any more difficult." He cast her as the villain in a story he helped write. "She's the only one making it difficult," Marisol's voice sliced in, sharp and eager. "All we're asking is for you to be reasonable." The word was a demand disguised as a request. "Reasonable?" Samantha repeated, her voice a soft, dangerous whisper that held a world of meaning. "Or do you mean obedient?" She held their ugly truth up to the light. The accusation struck home. Marisol surged forward, closing the space between them. She was inches from Samantha's face now, her voice dropping to a low, concentrated venom. "You are being ungrateful," she hissed, each word a poison dart. "After everything we have sacrificed for you, and you're over here hoarding money while we are forced to struggle. Do you really think you're going to walk away from this marriage with a single thing to your name? And you will have nothing if you continue down this path." In that moment, a profound stillness descended upon Samantha, a quiet certainty that anchored her soul. It was the feeling of a ship finding its harbor after a lifetime at sea. Her breath, once shallow with anxiety, now drew in, slow and deep, filling her with a cold, clear resolve. Her gaze, no longer flitting or deferential, locked onto each of them in turn, and from that newfound calm, she delivered the words that would shatter the very foundation of their world. "I don't owe either of you a single thing." The silence that crashed down was absolute, a physical void where the noise of their control had always been. A look of pure, slack-jawed astonishment bloomed on Marisol's face. Adrian's eyes blinked rapidly, the gears in her mind grinding to a halt, processing a reality she couldn't comprehend. For a long, suspended moment, they were statues, frozen in the aftershock of her declaration. They stared at Samantha, but it was as if a stranger had materialized in her place. In their eyes, a dawning horror grew the realization that they had never truly seen her at all. The woman before them was an unknown entity, forged in a fire they never knew was burning. With a grace that was almost unnerving, Samantha reached past Marisol's stunned form. The click of the stove knob turning off was a sound of absolute finality. She wiped her hands on a towel, a simple, deliberate act of cleansing herself of them. Then, she navigated around their frozen figures as if they were mere furniture in her path. She departed the kitchen, leaving behind a silence thick with the unspoken end of an era. Later, cocooned in the anonymous dark of her car, the sanctuary parked just outside the Nobile building, she performed the final rite of her liberation. Her fingers moved with purpose, emailing Valerie the arsenal she had so carefully collected. One by one, the recordings were uploaded into the digital ether. Every coerced conversation, every honeyed word that concealed a command, every veiled threat, Each file was a shackle, and she was now handing over the key. Her escape was no longer a whispered dream, it was an avalanche already in motion. Consciousness found Samantha in the pre-dawn stillness, long before the sun had breached the horizon. The apartment was bathed in a cool, impersonal blue, the light of a place that was no longer home. From the other room, the sound of Adrian's breathing, a faint, oblivious snore, was the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a world she was about to leave behind forever. Blissfully unaware of the seismic shift occurring just outside, Marisol's door remained a silent, wooden sentinel, sealed shut. A thick, oppressive silence bleeding from its seams, a silence Samantha knew all too well. In that moment, Samantha stood frozen in the narrow, shadowed artery of the hallway, allowing the house's heavy stillness to wrap around her, not as a blanket, but as a suit of invisible armor. This scene had played out 100, 1,000 times in the theater of her mind, a desperate dress rehearsal, for the one performance that truly mattered. Now, the stage was set. Her hand, surprisingly steady, placed a single folded note on the cold kitchen table. Every word on it was a shield. Simple, vague, deliberately impersonal. Asterisk, I'm staying with a friend for a few days. Asterisk, a lie, but a necessary one. Asterisk, I need space. Asterisk, the truest words she'd written in years. Asterisk, don't call me. Asterisk, a command, not a request. Asterisk, I'll reach out when I'm ready. Asterisk, a promise to herself, a severance from them. There were no apologies, no cracks in the facade for emotion to seep through, nothing they could contort into a weapon, nothing they could use to pull her back. This was a clean cut. She hoisted the last of her bags, the weight of her escape feeling strangely light. These were the artifacts of her secret rebellion, smuggled piece by piece over the past week, hidden in plain sight, while they saw nothing. She slipped through the front door, a ghost leaving her own haunting, and pulled it shut behind her. The lock made a soft, final clicker sound that was both an ending and a beginning, the period at the end of a life sentence. Outside, the pre-dawn air was shockingly cool and clean against her skin. A baptism. The world was still, painted in shades of charcoal and ink, with the faintest promise of gold on the horizon. Methodically, Samantha loaded the bags into the car, each one a brick in the foundation of her new life. She slid behind the wheel, the worn fabric of the driver's seat feeling like a throne. And then, a breath escaped her lips, a ragged, shuddering exhale that carried the weight of years. It was the first breath that felt entirely her own. A tremor ran through her hands on the steering wheel, not from fear, but from the raw, electric current of liberation. It was adrenaline, a powerful, cleansing surge of pure release. She turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, a low growl that shattered the morning silence as she pointed the car east, driving directly into the coming dawn, toward Nob Hill. The city's arteries were nearly empty, hers to command at this sacred hour. In the distance, a familiar neon sign was a flickering, hopeful beacon, still glowing against the fading night as she finally pulled into the quiet lot. In the secluded asphalt square behind the anonymous apartment building, a wave of profound stillness washed over her, a quiet she hadn't known she'd lost. She ascended the stairs, each step a deliberate severing from her past, and turned the key. The click of the lock echoed like a final, decisive word. She stepped into a space scrubbed clean, a blank canvas awaiting her life's first true colors. It hummed with a nascent warmth, a promise of sanctuary, her new life, her own home. The keys landed on the counter, a small, definitive sound of arrival. She began to unpack, not just objects, but the very foundations of her future. Perching on the edge of the simple mattress, a throne in her new kingdom, she let the reality of the moment sink into her bones. Pale afternoon sunlight crept through the blinds, painting the empty room in soft, hopeful strokes of amber. And in that light, a truth dawned. For the first time in 9 long years, she was breathing air that wasn't thick with the weight of someone else's demands. Later, the quiet introspection gave way to focused action. Across a polished desk, Valerie's eyes scanned the evidence, a battlefield map of Samantha's ordeal. The attorney absorbed every detail, the recordings, the meticulously crafted timeline. She was not just reviewing facts. She was witnessing the architecture of a meticulously planned escape. The documentation was a fortress, built brick by painful brick. Valerie looked up, her gaze holding not pity, but profound respect. "You've done everything right," she affirmed, her voice a blade of cold professional certainty. "The filing went through today." The words hung in the air, an irreversible declaration. And just like that, by noon, the war had officially begun. A formal petition for the dissolution of a poisoned marriage was now in the hands of the Banalo County Court, a war cry on paper. The charges were laid bare: emotional abuse, insidious manipulation, and the cold, hard proof of financial strangulation. Attached were the ghosts of conversations past, the digital specters of her torment. Every venomous, calculated word that had dripped from the lips of Adrienne and Marisol was now captured, catalogued, and aimed right back at them. That afternoon, a crisp manila envelope found its way into Adrienne's hands, a paper bomb waiting to detonate his world. Miles away, Samantha didn't need to see it. She felt the seismic shock of his discovery in her very bones. In her mind's eye, she saw the scene unfold, the slow-motion crumpling of the paper in his fist. She could almost hear the shattered disbelief in his voice, the volcanic eruption of narcissistic rage. Then, the inevitable, frantic call to Marisol, his voice choked with the poison of perceived betrayal. Her own phone began to tremble, a relentless assault on her newfound peace. A torrent of digital venom pleas turning to demands. Demands to accusations flooded her screen. She watched the screen glow with his fury, a storm she had no intention of weathering. With a single, decisive tap, she severed the digital tether, silencing a decade of control. Marisol's name followed his into the void. And then, a stillness so profound it had a sound of its own. A beautiful, expansive silence that was the very definition of freedom. Later that evening, Samantha stood in the heart of her new life, her small, bare apartment. She listened, truly listened, to the gentle hum of the refrigerator, a mundane symphony of independence. The floorboards offered a soft creak, a gentle whisper of welcome from the old building. This wasn't the sound of emptiness. It was the rich, quiet comfort of her own undisputed space. Curled on a mattress on the floor, she pulled a single blanket around her shoulders. She let the calm pour into the hollow spaces inside her, a balm on old wounds. A quiet certainty settled deep in her soul. She wasn't a fugitive from her own life. This wasn't an act of hiding. She was no longer prey. She had simply turned and walked out of the cage, the key forged from her own courage. And for the first time in nearly 10 long years, a time she had almost forgotten how to measure, Samantha felt the profound, bone-deep sensation of being safe. 1 year later, the world of Samantha Cortez was a universe away from the one she'd escaped. It bore no scars, no echoes of the life that had been imposed upon her. The constant, grinding noise of his expectations had faded to nothing. The tension that had lived in her shoulders, the feeling of being perpetually watched, was gone. The modest apartment in Nob Hill had become more than a home. It was her anchor, a quiet, sun-drenched sanctuary where she was the sole architect of her days. Here, she could take a full, deep breath without the instinct to look over her shoulder. Here, her own thoughts were the only judgment that mattered. The phantom tension in her shoulders at dawn was the first thing to vanish. No longer did she wake to the anticipated sting of Marisol's judgment or the heavy weight of Adrienne's unspoken disapproval. In their place, a profound peace settled. Her mornings unfolded now, not rushed, but savored. The ritual of coffee on the balcony, the soft whisper of music, a quiet that wasn't empty, but felt like a cool, silken balm on a long-held burn. In the months that unspooled, after the final signature, Samantha discovered a truth about herself. Independence wasn't a lightning strike, a sudden, dramatic arrival. It was the quiet, patient work of laying one brick of self-worth upon another, a careful, deliberate reconstruction of a soul. She poured herself into understanding the legacy Gloria had entrusted to her, the properties becoming a map to her own capability. She met with a real estate advisor, absorbing the new language of tenant agreements, maintenance schedules, and the unyielding logic of taxes. The work was often a challenge, a puzzle she hadn't known she could solve, but with each solution, A new layer of strength solidified within her. She kept pristine records, orchestrated repairs with a steady hand, and in a burst of inspiration, renovated the uptown unit herself. The smell of fresh paint mingling with her newfound freedom. She saw the results in the new, modern fixtures that gleamed under the lights. A strange thing began to happen. People now sought her out, asking for her opinion, a reversal of roles that sent a private, warm ripple of pride through her every time. Most days, her world was framed by the view from her living room, where she worked remotely from, a modest desk tucked into an alcove, a small command center that looked out onto the bustling street below. Her design, client list bloomed, first doubling, then tripling, as if nourished by her new spirit. Without the constant, draining tax on her emotions, her creativity, once a timid visitor, came flooding back, a homecoming she hadn't dared to hope for. She was relearning the sound of her own voice in the quiet of her apartment, a voice that was soft, yet unbreakable, quiet, yet resonant, with a strength she was finally claiming as her own. But the one place that would truly redefine her, but of all her possessions, it was the cabin in Corrales that truly owned a piece of her soul, a place she fled to. The pilgrimage was weekly, sometimes more frequent, a desperate escape. It was her sanctuary when the noise of the world, and the ghosts within it, grew too loud. There, on 2 acres of sun-baked New Mexico earth, the cabin stood as a quiet testament to endurance. It was cradled by the whispering arms of ancient cottonwoods, a solitary figure against the landscape. In the distance, the Sandia Mountains etched a jagged, permanent line against the sky, a promise of stability. Even the wind spoke a different language here, a sound she could feel in her bones. It was a lighter sound, as if it had shed the world's burdens somewhere over the mesas. As it moved through the sagebrush, it carried a whisper of release, a secret invitation to let go. With every visit, she felt a knot inside her chest, one she hadn't known was there, finally begin to unravel. Beside the porch, she coaxed a small desert garden to life, a stubborn patch of green in the ochre dust. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused as she sanded the wooden steps, smoothing away the splinters of the past. She gave new life to the old rocking chair, the one Gloria had sat in, feeling a connection to a strength beyond her own. In that chair, she began to understand the quiet resilience passed down from one woman to another. She learned to distinguish the lonely cry of coyotes at dusk, seeing them not as threats, but as fellow survivors. She watched the way the morning light would pour across the floorboards, a slow, golden tide washing the room clean. She was claiming the cabin, not with purchases, but with presence, weaving her own story into its timbers. Every act was a ritual, a deliberate choice to build a life from the fragments left behind. The thought of romance was a distant country she had no desire to visit. It wasn't fear that held her back. That emotion had long since burned itself out. It was simply the wrong season, a quiet winter for the soul that was necessary for any spring to follow. Her heart was a student, tentatively relearning the rhythm of beating for one person, and one person only. For herself. The process of healing became its own silent, sacred purpose. It was a journey mapped out in quiet moments and solitary discoveries. She would lose herself on long drives through the Rio Grande Valley, letting the road decide her direction. She wandered through farmers' markets, drawn to the simple, vibrant pulse of life. She joined a pottery class, a place of blessed anonymity where her hands could speak what her voice could not. There, surrounded by strangers who didn't know her scars, she slowly, gently, reclaimed her own space. She was learning to exist in the world without apology, without making herself small. And sometimes, in the quiet, she would think of Adrian and imagine the profound shock on his face. That shock curdled into a white-hot anger, and the anger burned itself out, leaving only the cold ash of desperation. And then, after that, a profound, hollow silence. The divorce was a blade, swift and clean, cutting through the rot with an efficiency she found grimly satisfying, all thanks to the undeniable truth captured in those recordings, and the ironclad legal wall of her own separate property. He walked away with nothing, not a single cent. And Marisol, she evaporated from Samantha's world with the same startling speed with which she had materialized. In the beginning, the silence she left behind felt alien, a phantom limb still aching. Then, it blossomed into the sweet, deep breath of relief. Samantha felt the hate for them simply dissolve. The love had died long ago. All that remained was a neutral void. She had finally set down the crushing, invisible weight of trying to map the geography of their senseless cruelty. The only things she salvaged from the wreckage of that life were the lessons, like scars, and a new, steely resolve forged in that fire. No one would ever hold that kind of power over her soul again. Now, on an evening where autumn was just beginning to whisper in the air, she sat, nestled on the porch of the Corrales cabin, a fortress of solitude and peace, wrapped in a blanket that felt like an embrace, a ceramic mug of tea warming the hollows of her palms. The sky above was a vast, liberating expanse, a canvas bleeding from the last embers of orange into a bruised rose, then deepening into a velvety violet. The New Mexico sunset had always felt like a sacred ritual to her, a holy moment. But tonight, it was more. It felt like a personal promise, a final, whispered benediction from the universe itself. Her thoughts drifted, finding their way to Gloria, and then beyond her, to the woman. She truly was the woman who had stockpiled her earnings in the quietest corners, who had architected this escape in secret, and who had bequeathed Samantha the keys to a future she was only now learning how to inhabit. Needed. A new life forged not from the cold glitter of currency, but from the unshakable bedrock of truth, inner strength, and the power to choose her own dawn. A single phrase, "Thank you," escaped her lips, a fragile offering to the descending twilight. It was a sound meant only for her own soul, a quiet acknowledgement, in a world that had demanded she scream. As the sun surrendered its last ray, behind the stoic peaks, the sky bled a final, glorious spectacle of gold. With it, a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding for years was released, carrying with it the phantom weight of ghosts and grievances that had clung to her very marrow. She felt them dissipate into the ether. She had crawled through a labyrinth of lies, weathered the daggers of broken trust, and mourned in the empty halls of loss. But in this moment, bathed in the afterglow of a day's end, she was utterly and irrevocably unbound.